everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to be able to share this opportunity with you and have Myra present a really awesome session. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Myra.
Great. Thank you, Shelby. And thanks, Global Genes, for this opportunity, and Sam at the Orphan Disease Center for making the beautiful connection. I'm Myra Sack, and I'm doing this session from New Hampshire, and we have only an hour together, and we have a whole hour together. So that sort of gives you a sense of how I think about grief, which is sort of holding two opposite ways of thinking, of seeing things, of feeling at the same time. I'm going to share my screen and slides in the interest of getting as much information across as possible, but please know that at any moment you have a thought, a reflection, a question, just stick it in the chat. If it's something that you'd like to directly message to me, I'll make sure to stay on a few minutes after and just check through them. And the last thing is that there's a handful of aspects of this session that are typically more sort of reflective in nature, and I often give them more space. Time is just an hour, so I'm going to sort of introduce some of these prompts to you and then likely sort of race through the moments where you'd actually get to play with them. So please take note of them if they'd feel meaningful to you or your organization so that you can revisit. If you're able to get off video, that's just like a lot less lonely. But if you're not, I completely understand. So there's no judgment. Okay. With that, let's do slides, which I hope are not. Can everyone see a screen that's purple? I just get a thumbs up. Cool. Okay. So this session is fundamentally about supporting one another through the grief experience. Our plan for today is I'm going to introduce what we call the emotion values. Emotions, the organization I started, which is all about how we change the way the world interacts and supports grieving people. I'll share some opening context and reflection, talk about what I mean when I write learning the language of loss, share my story and why I spend my days talking about grief, and then introduce some grief education and advocacy and leave you with some research and practice related to how we enhance coping and some frameworks on showing up and connecting. So at Emotion, we talk about 3 values. So I'll ask you to indulge me and embody these with me right now. The first is about presence. This is about being where our feet are. And so if you can, just in this moment, kind of wiggle your toes, smush those heels into the ground or the floor beneath you, and just be here. Like, let's use this time together in a meaningful way. The second value is about honoring all feelings, and this is essential in grief work. And I'll ask you to just tap your heart twice to embody this value. This is about not judging anything that comes up. And so some of us might be feeling lightness or laughter. Some of us might be feeling anguish, confusion, numbness, whatever that is in this moment or other moments. We just sort of notice them, become conscious of them so they don't hijack our nervous system, but certainly let's not judge them. And the third value is about connection versus comparison. And in the spirit of the Olympics, we talk about sort of avoiding the loss Olympics when we talk about this value. This means that if we win the loss Olympics, our loss is somehow a loss that no one in the history of humanity has ever inhabited, and we're standing on a podium that's quite lonely. If we lose the loss Olympics, we somehow feel like our loss isn't big enough, isn't deep enough, isn't immense enough to measure up. And that's a really minimizing space to be in. And so instead, indulge me one more time, we just connect at the heart space, and we lift our elbows to do this if we were in circle, and we just tap elbows with the person to our left and right to just connect with our own deepest pain so that we can access someone else's. These values are values you can use in your own spaces to make sure that what you are facilitating, what you are inhabiting, is a grief-conscious space. This quote comes from Francis Weller, who is a grief activist and a psychotherapist, and he writes that it's really our unexpressed sorrows that block access to our soul or whatever part of you feels deepest, and that in order to move freely, we have to clear the way. And the way we do that is to talk about hard things, to speak of sorrow. And I lead with this because this is all about intention in grief work. Seeing processing grief as peace building, seeing processing grief as preventative work. And when we do this, we create space for people to understand and believe that speaking of sorrow has real power. I talk about the word intention, and I just share with you that intention comes from the Latin root tendere, which actually means to stretch. And so when you think about doing physical activity, we often stretch before, so we don't pull a muscle, or we can sort of like be our best athlete. And the same is true for emotional work, is that we need to stretch, we need to set an intention in order to be able to do hard emotional work. This is one of those personal reflections that I often ask folks to consider, and I'm just going to share it with you. You can jot it down, you can jot the questions down and consider it sort of as I'm talking or later. But it's a 6-word activity, and there's 2 questions. So the first is, what is one story of hope you are carrying? And try to share that story in 6 words only, no more and no fewer. And I'll give you my example. And the second 6 words is, what do you wish someone knew about the heaviness or grief or loss you're holding? And so my examples, just to give you a sense, is the first one, story of hope, is when my toddler laughs until pee. Okay. And my story of heaviness is ask me about her big eyes. So you can sort of take that exercise where you like. The point of it is to demonstrate a really powerful principle in grief work, which is all about the unity of opposites. So this is that we are constantly carrying 2 seemingly opposite emotions at the same time. In this case, I'm asking you to play with hope and heaviness. And that can be both exhausting and exhilarating. And so carrying those 2 kinds of opposing emotions takes space. And we have to learn how to create that space in order to move with loss. And we have to be able to honor both at different times in order to move with loss. The one sort of question that I'd ask you to just like notice when you're doing this is, which one of these comes more easily to you? Like, which one just pours out of you where you feel like you could write 100 different 6-word stories? And which one do you feel like needs more attention? Like maybe you haven't turned towards. So I apologize for giving this less space, but I'm just bringing this up as a future exercise. I'm going to now shift to just kind of grounding us in a shared definition, because grief gets a lot of talk time, and it's sometimes hard to appreciate both the vastness of it and the specificity in it. And so I define grief generally as the human process of moving with loss. And that loss could be so many different kinds of losses. It could be physical, like a death. It could be physical, like a loss of a limb. It could be social relational, a breakup, a divorce, an aging or sick family member. It could be job related, so occupational, role related. That loss could be emotional, the loss of a dream, a right. It could be personal, friendship, your sense of security or personhood. And the loss could be ambiguous. This comes from Pauline Boss's work. Ambiguous loss means that someone might be psychologically absent but physically present, or the reverse might be true. And so again, sort of take a moment to consider which of these losses in this moment resonates with you most. And as we move through this time together, tap into what is connect with the content. Traumatic grief is different, and traumatic grief is defined by Dr. Joanne Cacciatore. She's a traumatic grief scholar out in Cornville, Arizona, professor at ASU and also a counselor, but she defines traumatic grief as the following. You can sort of see them on the slide. So sudden or unexpected, violent or disfiguring, the death of a child, any type of homicide or suicide, a death that follows prolonged suffering. And then a really important note here is that traumatic grief might be subject to cultural interpretation. So if you feel like you or someone you know has experienced traumatic grief and it's not honored here, that's simply because it is, and there's just not enough room on the slide. The challenge with this reality that there are so many losses, that it's ubiquitous, that's really the only thing we share in common, our kind of mainstream American response to grief has been a culture of amnesia or anesthesia, like this forget and numb, or that grief's a problem to be solved, or it's something to get over, or that there are stages that we're meant to follow and complete. This is sort of the misinterpretation of Dr. Kubler-Ross's work in the 5 stages of grief. That grief is un-American, the going gets tough, the tough gets going, or that grief is not to be discussed. And consider, are there other powerful messages that you've received as a grieving person or as someone trying to show up for a griever? And just sort of note the power in each of these messages that we get implicitly and explicitly. And I don't believe that these messages are out of malintent. I think they're really fear-based responses. And it's fear of saying the wrong thing, or that we can't do enough, or that we're going to make things worse, or that the person's never going to be the same again. Or maybe we're afraid of our own pain. Maybe that grief's contagious, which is something I've experienced, or that we're just afraid of feeling because we don't have kind of emotional literacy baked into our systems of education and care. And so consider where you see in your personal or professional life, where those powerful messages on the previous slide show up, and where do they show up in you? To what extent have you internalized them? And again, we would give this a lot of space to sort of breathe, but just take notes that feel relevant. And also consider, what other messages would you share or add? My slides are in purple and I wear purple. This is my daughter. I come to this work through her. Her name's Javi. Javi means life, ironically. And she was born 2 years to the day of my husband Matt and my wedding anniversary, September 4th, 2018. And she was and is beautiful and strong and seemingly healthy and all the things. And she died when she was just under 2.5 years old from Tay-Sachs disease, which many of you know in this space is a fatal neurodegenerative disease. Matt and I Both underwent preconception, so before Javi was even an idea, preconception genetic testing. But unfortunately, tragically, a physician ordering error had been made on Matt's carrier screening testing, and so he was misreported as not a carrier, when in fact he was a carrier for Tay-Sachs. And so we got pregnant, thinking that we would have a healthy child. And Javi's life arc was much shorter than it should have been, but it was still an arc. And so sort of from the left of the screen was the outfit that she was in the day she was born. The second photo is her at 1. So I was maybe at this point trying to push sports and getting her basketball in hand. And then the third picture, she's sort of noticeably weaker and also noticeably more beautiful and big-eyed. And the fourth and fifth picture are the last several months of her life. And the final photo on the right is one of the last days of her life on Earth, January 20th, 2021. And so the question for us became, what do you do? Like when the worst thing happens, or the worst thing to us at that time happens, how do you live? How do you respond? And in that moment was December 17th, 2019. That's what we call Diagnosis Day. We really experienced this personal crisis of faith. And I think we were in an apocalyptic time. That's not my language, that's Kate Boyer, theologian. Apocalyptic comes from Greek, to lay bare. And so when your soul, when you are ripped open and you are sort of laid bare, maybe in somewhat an ironic way, maybe the way that you think and can imagine moving in life becomes more creative. And it did for us. We imagined this concept called Shabirthdays, which came from this idea that I couldn't imagine Javi only having 2 birthdays on this earth. And so we knew we had celebrated Shabbat every Friday. And if we combined birthday with Shabbat and called them Shabirthdays, we wanted to see how many Shabirthdays we could get. And it felt much more, with Javi on Earth, I should say, and it felt much more manageable to exist from one Shabirthday to the next, from one Friday to the next, as opposed to thinking about a time horizon beyond a week that just felt too scary and unsettling. And so a handful of days after Javi's diagnosis, we saw a rabbi. A bunch of our friends said, you have to go see a rabbi. Like, how do you even process this? And so we said, yeah, probably a good idea. We weren't members of a synagogue, but we found a rabbi. And Matt and I shared this really proud moment with her and said, we've come up with this idea of celebrating Shabirthdays. Isn't that sort of brilliant? And she looked at us and said, no, I don't think you should do that. I think that's a really bad idea. And we said, why? And she said, because how are you going to live when Javi dies? How are you going to exist on Fridays when Javi dies if you do something like this? And fortunately, we had each other and we had the presence of mind to say that, excuse my language, that was bullshit. And we moved ahead with it anyway and had 57 Shabirthdays with Javi on Earth, 57 Fridays, which is the name of the memoir that I wrote. And they were the most meaningful Fridays of my life. And now we still honor them in very different ways today. I share this version, this sliver of Javi's story with you all because it's a beautiful opportunity to talk about my daughter, but more importantly, because it's an example of a fear-based response to grief. And it's a really powerful one because it comes from a spiritual leader. And so I raise it to sort of raise everyone's consciousness about how often and in how many different spaces these fear-based responses are coming at us, and how important it is for us to feel equipped to respond the way that feels right to us, the way that honors our own grief experience. But we're really afraid of pain and struggle and suffering. And so we strive to live this life of happiness, ease, and comfort. The rabbi went on to say, just take a lot of pictures. And it so misses it. It so misses the opportunity for depth and to sort of walk the harrowing bridge between the land of the living and the land of the dead, and to honor how powerful and how steadying actually that bridge can be when we learn how to walk it. So this fear of society comes at a real cost to us, I believe. And I'll welcome more conversation. I'll leave plenty of room for questions at the end, or by plenty of room, I mean maybe 5 minutes. But emotional repression, and this comes from James Pennebaker's work on, it's from his paper, The Healing Power of Expressing Emotions. And he did his research on the sort of physical and mental toll that it takes when we emotionally repress. And what he found, unsurprisingly, is that it impacts our body's immunity. We're more vulnerable to illness. And we can demonstrate this in really simple ways. Like I won't ask you to do this exercise, but if you imagine sort of holding your arms out, elbows straight, and sort of hold them away from your body for a minute without dropping them and without bending your elbows. Then for 5 minutes, if I asked you to do that, what that would feel like, where you would start to feel ache and pain and tension, and the ways that your body might contort itself to try to compensate. It's because that energy that we're resisting is looking for places to show up in us. And it often shows up in the forms of aches and illness. And so you can apply that same sort of physical exercise to emotional work. And if you imagine sort of keeping hard and heavy things at a distance for too long, it takes a toll on your body. So what's a better approach? What's a different approach? This graph is not drawn to scale. And the next, or I share another graph that is also not drawn to scale. But I'll just orient you to the slide. On the left side of this slide, the y-axis is energy exerted over time. And on the x-axis, the bottom of the slide is a state of being that you're in any moment, that we're in any moment. And so moving from left to right, being in a state of avoidance, what we were just talking about, actually takes the most energy. It's why we often then turn to things that are distracting or numbing or that help us forget, because it's so exhausting to avoid. Compartmentalization is maybe the state that we are most familiar with. It's sort of like putting something in a box so that we can go do the other thing. But it suggests that then we sort of go and we revisit it. We come back to it. The thing to sort of ask yourself is, do you think that you're a master compartmentalizer, but actually you never really revisit? And so if you just keep compartmentalizing, is that actually just avoidance? And we did this work with some of the players in the National Women's Soccer League, some of whom just won the gold medal in Paris. And many of them started to talk about how brilliantly they compartmentalized until they realized that they actually were just avoiders, and that avoidance was linked to different moments of injury, to burnout. And so sort of take note of where you are. All the way to the right is this integrated state. This is learning how to integrate our grief. And this comes from Dr. Bruce Perry's work on dosed, moderate, and predictable stressors. So what this means is that as we're moving with hard things, we can't just like sit in an office for 7 hours and cry or talk one-on-one with a therapist and do that for 7 hours every day. That is the opposite of dosed, moderate, maybe it's predictable. It is severe, prolonged, and if someone asked you to do that without warning, it would be unpredictable. Learning how to be in this state of integration requires us to come up with ways that we can interact with our grief in these dosed, moderate, and predictable ways. What this means is, are Wednesday mornings for 3 minutes with one particular song, is that a moment that you turn towards something hard? For me, it was continuing to make a blueberry smoothie because that's what I had to make Javi when she lost the ability to chew. And so for years after she died, I needed to hear that blender every morning, and I needed to see the bright blue color of the smoothie. And so that was a way that I interacted with my grief that was dosed, and it was moderate, and it was predictable. I knew it was coming. And living in integration is how we build resilience. It's the opposite of being vulnerable or sensitized to hard and heavy things. This work you can explore more of if you're interested in at least sort of the dose, moderate, and predictable concept in Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah's book on, it's called What Happened to You. It's a brilliant book. So how do we move from this state of being that's scared, this fear of, and if you indulge me and just switch the C and the A, you move from scared to sacred. And how do we do that? Another 2 graphs that are not drawn to scale that I'll show you very quickly. The left side of this slide is the traditional approach to grief, which is the y-axis is 1 to 10 grief intensity. So on day 1, year 1, your grief intensity is at an 8 or a 9 or a 10. This model suggests that over time, your grief just reduces, and it will. I don't believe that to be true. And research really supports a different approach, which is that grief is wild and fluid and untamed and is not meant to be managed. But instead, what we can focus on is enhancing our coping capacity. And when we do that, we become much more capable of existing in the world. But oftentimes in clinical settings, we focus so much on what's someone's grief. And if it's an 8, 9, or 10, we're afraid of it. Versus my grief is always at an 8, 9, or 10, and it probably will be for the rest of my life. But my coping capacity is also typically at an 8, 9, or 10. And so you don't have to be afraid for me. And that's a really different way of looking at grieving people and also supporting grieving people. How do we move that coping capacity number for folks, as opposed to sort of focusing on how do we reduce someone's grief, which is a tall order. So if anyone ever tells you you just do something in 3 steps, they're definitely lying. And I recognize that I'm in some ways representing this way. So I really apologize for oversimplifying, but this is just meant to be an introduction to thinking about how to enhance coping. Step 1, I think about as self-awareness. I think I said this maybe 30 minutes ago, which is we have to make feelings conscious so that we can work with them. If they're not conscious, that's when they become quite dangerous to us. So how do we learn how to access what we're feeling? There is a note under self-awareness, the last phrase in the light purple, emotional granularity. This comes from Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's work at Northeastern. And this is all about learning to be as specific as we can about our emotions so that we can enhance our capacity to cope. And she has done tremendous research on this topic, and you can listen to her speak on it. But this is about the more quickly we can name with specificity what we're feeling, the better off we'll be. So an example that's coming to mind in this moment is I just saw earlier this morning a girl and her mom holding hands, walking into the first day of preschool or something up here in New Hampshire. And at first I felt like extreme jealousy and resentment. And if I had stayed there, I would have acted differently than when I got underneath that feeling and tried to do this work of emotional granularity. Like, no, it's not quite just resentment that I'm feeling. Then it became like anguish, like just immense anguish. But then it was more than anguish even, it was yearning. It was like yearning for the touch of Javi's hand, like wanting to hold her hand in mine. And what that told me was that before this session with you, I needed to like make some time to be with her and to engage in that feeling. If I had acted from the place of envy or resentment, I probably would have like made sort of a mean face at the mom or walked away or, just gone through my day very differently. So that's the power of emotional granularity. Once we know how we're actually feeling, then we can learn to trust ourselves and express. This is the greatest defense to anyone who says something to us that might be hurtful. So if someone says, at least you can have other children, at least you were young, or at least Javi was young, whatever that means. If I know myself and my feelings, I can create what I call psychological Teflon, which is I can like dress myself in Teflon, that stuff just comes right off of. And so as I'm moving in the world, if someone says something that's minimizing, I know myself so well and I trust my feelings that I don't let that impact my relationship with my daughter who's dead. And that's really important because when we start to doubt our grief, we get smaller. And that's a really vulnerable position to inhabit in the world. The way we express, I give some examples. Rituals and micro rituals are probably the most powerful. And movement is another one. Again, from Dr. Bruce Perry's work, the patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity of movement is naturally regulating. What this means is that the strongest and first somatosensory memory that we have is the one we have from when we were in the womb, in our mother's womb, and we heard that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity of our mother's heartbeat. And movement taps into that same patterned, repetitive activity, and it serves as a buffer to hard emotions. And so taking a walk and being with hard, heavy emotions is a meaningful strategy to moving with grief. So considering the ways you can integrate that either professionally or personally is something worth considering. Only once we're aware and we trust ourselves and we have ways of expressing, then can we be in community with others. Being in community with others when we're grieving is hard. And so I'll share a couple frameworks for how I think about that. This is emphasizing, underscoring the power of social connectedness. And yet, grieving people are left pretty vulnerable because most people don't have a language of loss. And so we notice that grievers tend to isolate, and that is not their fault. It is really an absence of community education and literacy, which is why it's just so meaningful and important that Global Gene says yes to something like this, to this kind of talk. I'm definitely not I'm not invited to all the parties. I never was, but now definitely not. So I apologize for how text heavy this is, and I believe Shelby will, I know this is being recorded and you're welcome to the slides if you'd like them, but this is an attempt for how do you show up Okay, so you say it's important. Well, what do you do? Like, you're someone who is really well-intentioned, but you don't know what to do, what to say. The next couple slides are more practical. The slide after this, I'll share some examples of real language, real turns of phrases that you might use. So the SAVVY framework, the S, the first letter is self-check. This is about considering who you are in relation to the grieving person. How close are you physically, emotionally? There are dynamics in the relationship to consider. In my example, my friends who had healthy children, it was hard for them to be the people who I turned to in my sort of most acute grief. And so it was helpful when they were aware of that and could sort of create scenarios in which they were showing up for me, but they were not necessarily the first person or the person who I was talking to directly. And then maybe even more importantly here is, as you show up, make sure your intentions are directed towards the grieving person's needs, not your own. So this is about being free of your own agenda. And again, this takes self-awareness. Am I, as the person who's showing up, am I bringing my own stuff here? Like, am I afraid? And so am I coming to this conversation with fearful language? Am I showing up in a way that is about making myself feel better, or am I showing up for the person who needs me? And that is an awareness question. A is action-oriented. This is about doing things, saying things, writing things, big, small. We're so afraid to do or say the wrong thing, but silence is painful as hell. And so more is more. And if you offend someone, say sorry. Like, if you do or say the wrong thing, apologize after. But I can almost guarantee you that a text message that says I'm thinking about you, or a handwritten letter in the mail that says I blew it 5 years ago and I didn't know how to be there, and naming their person and acknowledging something about them, like, that will never be taken in a hurtful way. The first V is vulnerability. This is self-explanatory, but this is really about being open yourself so that someone else feels like they can bare their soul. And a way we can do that when we're showing up for someone is to just say that, like, I'm scared as hell for you, like naming it. Or this is like really way out of my comfort zone, and I feel like I am screwing up every left and right, and it makes me feel horrible. That opens the door for someone to say, well, yeah, like these couple of things didn't land well, but like, thank you, and here's how we can move. The second V is values-based. Requires us to actually understand and know what's important to the person you're supporting. What do they appreciate? What's their faith system, religion, spirituality, or absence of those? And what do they embrace? What do they not embrace? And then align your support to theirs. There's nothing worse than hearing something that goes against your value system, and it could have been so easily avoided with just a question of, like, tell me about what gives you comfort, if anything. And it makes total sense to me that nothing does. Like, what's your relationship to religion? Just ask. And don't say, like, what's your relationship to religion? And let me tell you about how I think you should think about religion, obviously. And then the last letter, Y, I think gives us as supporters an opportunity to sort of be let off the hook, because this Y tells us that grief work and grief support is year-round. Grief Awareness Day is August 30th, but I can guarantee that any grieving person is not just grieving on Grief Awareness Day, or is not only grieving on the anniversary of someone's death or on their birthday. They are grieving at every missed milestone. And those losses, they accrue every single day. And so the good news about that is, as someone who wants to show up, that gives us a chance to show up 3 months later, 3 years later, 30 years later, and to know that it's gonna mean something. So what do we do with this framework? I think about it in terms of this word remembering. And on the left side of this slide, these phrases are dismembering or disconnecting phrases. Dis means to cut off or exclude. And remembering, re means again. Remembering and reconnecting. When we remember someone, we bring them into membership again and again and again. That's really powerful and active. And so, starting at the top, it could be worse. That can be a very disconnecting phrase. It's minimizing, it's distancing. Instead, we might ask, do you want to talk about what you're holding? And I won't go through each one of these, and I invite you to add your own, edit this, push back. This is certainly not like the Bible for what to say. It's just sort of a general framework for how to think about these. But if you turn your attention to the second to last phrase on the left side, I can't imagine. I think that that's a really well-intentioned phrase that I used to say all the time. And sometimes, honestly, I still slip up. Being in this work, I hear and see and experience so much tragedy that sometimes it is truly hard to imagine. But the challenge with I can't imagine is it's really distancing, and it might make someone feel like an alien. Like, can't imagine your life, like holy that's a little bit dehumanizing, versus when I try to imagine losing my son to cancer, I lose the ability to talk. My legs go numb. Like, I'm devastated for you. And I'm here, and I don't know what else to say. That is much more connecting, and that closes the space between you and the griever. And it actually requires you in the moment, like I have a son, it actually requires you to imagine that loss. That is doing the deep, hard work of connection. So there's probably a billion other phrases. I'm sure that I get some of these wrong. I imagine that there are tweaks to these that would make them so powerful, and I'd love to hear from you either in Q&A or another time, or have someone build out a more robust list. So this is really just a jumping off point for us. A handful of reflections to consider in the context of this work is, if you sort of go back to that savvy framework, which maybe I'll just go back to it. Like, which of these are you really good at? Like, which one are you like, oh, I nail that every time or most times? And which one are you like not so good at? And is it relationship dependent? And then sort of flipping the question, which of these do you most appreciate? person? And which of these are hard for you? Like, is it actually hard for you to get a note? And you're like, Myra, that's not good for me, you know? So again, this is just meant to sort of be a guide as needed. And before we move to closing, I'm gonna invite you to revisit, now that we've been immersed in grief work and you've heard my voice for too long, I'm gonna invite you to revisit that first question that I asked, which was the those two 6-word questions. And I'm gonna ask you to engage in the activity in a super short amount of time. But the questions are, what is one story of hope you are carrying? And I'll put it in the chat. Oh, hold on. Could you please go back to the slide with phrases? Oh, I'm there. Okay. Svetlana, you're good? Okay. I'm so unsophisticated technologically. So the question that I'd like you to consider now that we've spent some time with this is, what is one story of hope you're carrying? 6 words only. And what is one story of heaviness you're carrying? Heaviness, grief, or loss that you wish someone knew. I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock. And when you have them, please, if you're comfortable, put them in the chat. And if not, that's totally okay. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Spend 30 more seconds. And then if you're comfortable, put either or both in the chat. And then as a group, let's just sort of soak in what people are carrying for a minute or so. Okay, come back, come back, come back. I invite anyone who is up for it, and then I'll keep moving us, but anyone who's up for it to share their words in the chat. And just invite everyone to soak in what people are bravely sharing. These are so amazing. Thank you all. Let's take just a collective breath. Actually, we'll take 3. And the way we do these at Emotion is we'll take a big inhale. And when you think you've got all the air, take an extra sip at the top. And then a big exhale, and kind of watch your breath land at the toes you wiggled in the beginning of this call. And we'll do that together 3 times. Okay? Just before we move to Q&A, for anyone who wants to join a virtual sacred circle, which is intentionally short, they're 5 to 7 minutes, and they're just an opportunity for you to honor the person in your life who has died or a loss you're experiencing. We meet virtually the first Wednesday of every month at 9:04 a.m. Eastern and 9:04 a.m. Pacific. And again, they're fewer than 10 minutes, so definitely be there on time so you can honor your person. I'm continuing to look at these incredible stories. The second resource is an audio series, a self-guided audio series that we just released called RX to Feel, which means prescription to feel. You can access it on SoundCloud or Insight Timer. The link's on our website. These are, again, in the spirit of kind of dosed, moderate, and predictable. They're really short, and they're meant to be done in motion, but any kind of motion is fine. Walking, running, stretching, almost stretching, like whatever. It's just meant to sort of be a companion for you when you're in movement. And each one introduces a different grief principle. 57 Fridays is the book that I wrote. It also has kind of an instructive synthesis at the end that is helpful for folks who need it. And then we have a whole bunch of other resources if you need it, or you know someone who does, at Emotion-M is our website. MC is movement community. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And just invite any questions in the 4 minutes we have together. Oh, how to access the RX. I will, let me just put the link in the chat right now. 57 Fridays is a memoir about my daughter's life and death, and it's really about the power of community to show up, and it chronicles those 57 Fridays that we shared with her on Earth and the first year after her death and the ways that we moved with that loss. It sort of honors relationships. It is really a book about how to live, not how to die. There is lots of love and lightness and heaviness in it. And I wrote it so that other people who have similar stories or different stories know that they should tell their story as well. And also that I want to kind of dissolve the intimacy barrier that we have about these things and share real, raw experiences so that we can be better. And thank you for having me so much and for sharing your beautiful words and your time.
Thank you so much, Myra, for this session. I think it was really moving and impactful. And I'm so appreciative that we were able to schedule this and have you present to our community today. So thank you.
Thanks, Shelby.